This is a lecture from OpenTuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.
At the end of the last chapter, we established that risk management had a number of good consequences. Greater certainty for investors of various types, more stable cash flows. But exactly how do we go about managing risk and indeed responding to risk so that these advantages can be achieved? And the first thing we have to look at is the risk management cycle, which is a very easy to apply approach really, and the steps within it are really very straightforward and sensible. What it says really first, we start at the top here, it says that you first of all have to identify the risk areas. You can't begin to manage risk unless you have some idea where they are, where they arise from. And we'll see various methods later on in this chapter as to how we might be able to get some clues or advanced warnings about where risky areas are and which might need our attention. Then we have to understand and assess the scale of the risk. We'll see that this is essentially looking at the probability that it might occur and the consequences if the risk does occur. And it could be that we identify a risk but decide that it's relatively trivial and in fact our risk response is to do nothing. But in other situations, if we identify a kind of material risk with a material probability and so on, we will have to do something about it. We develop a risk response strategy. For example, without anticipating too much what's coming on, if we see that there's a risk that somebody's going to get hurt using a piece of machinery or hurt going up a ladder, one of the risk response strategies is to perhaps give that person training. And what we then have to do is to implement that strategy and allocate responsibilities. There's no point going through all of this preparatory work and identifying risks, assessing risks, thinking, well, we should do that, if that's not actually done. And the way you do it really is to give a personal responsibility to someone and to give them dates and deadlines and so on that they have to report back to see to say what's been done with that risk and so on. Implement and monitor controls. This person to whom we've allocated the responsibility may not actually do it. We need some form of supervision or checkup to ensure that the controls and risk management approaches we want to be carried out are actually carried out. And then we see what the improvement might be. We're not going to get every risk satisfactorily dealt with at the first occasion. And anyway, risks are continually changing. So if you suddenly start exporting, then you will have new set of risks, like currency risks, if you're being paid in a foreign currency, or there could be the risks that goods get damaged or lost in transit and so on. And as risks rise and fall, then we have to adapt and keep changing our risk management system and what we're doing about it. A little bit at the top right here is saying that really, although ultimately the board is going to be responsible for the risk in the company and so on, the board will not be, in a large company, will not be on a day-to-day basis be identifying risk areas and so on. What tends to happen in large companies is they delegate this business of risk management to a risk management group and set certain overarching goals, if you like, about what this group should achieve. So how do we go about identifying risk areas? And lots of potential different ways of actually doing that. So physical inspection. You can go around and you can look at machinery, and you can look to see if all the proper guards are there, all the electrical wiring is properly covered and so on. You can make sure as you go around the factory that all the stairs have got proper handrails and the like. So regular physical inspection is one way of ensuring that you can identify some of the risks. In an office environment, making sure there are no cables going across the floor that people are likely to slip on and so on. You can inspect documents. For example, many companies, and indeed in the UK, you have to keep what's called an accident book. So every time somebody is injured, even relatively trivially in the business, you write it in the accident book, what happened, when, who, how serious it was, and so on. And by looking through similar sort of documents, then you will see, well, there seem to be a lot of accidents in this sort of area. Because of this cause, we've maybe identified a real recurring risk that we have to be dealing with. Ask people. Ask people about what they think might be a risky area, where they think maybe safety could be improved. Brainstorming, get a number of people sitting around and discussing all the almost what-ifs here. What we're trying to do in this, what we're trying to do in this risk identification phase here is really what I would say is throw the net wide. You want to kind of identify all risks that are possibly there, even if later on they turn out to be trivial, because unless you identify all risks, or try to identify all risks, there is the chance that quite an important risk gets overlooked. We can go through checklists. We can see we can look at other people's checklists. Have they signed this off correctly that these items have been properly inspected? In the UK, I think it's every year we have to have all our electrical plugs kind of certified. Our electrical equipment has to be kind of certified. And all the little plugs and the computers and so on, they all have a little sticker on the back saying, yes, this has been checked. That's a form of a checklist. Benchmarking. How do our incidents of, let's say, damage to employees, injury to employees, compare to other people's? So if you're in the building industry, and in the building industry there's a risk that people get cut, that they fall off scaffolding or ladders, and that raw materials falls on them perhaps there. And if we, in our large building company, see that maybe 4 people have been killed in the year, and in other comparable building companies between kind of 0 and 1 on average per annum are being fatally injured, then that is an indication, an identification, that there's something wrong in our health and safety on our building sites. External events. Maybe we see that a competitor has suffered a risk, or has suffered from a risk that's come to pass. So if you're in the airline and an aircraft crashes, then there's a big investigation, and being triggered from that air accident, quite often there is identified a risk. Look, that accident happened because they did this. You better change the way you're operating, or replace a part on the aircraft or something of that sort, because this has been identified externally. Internal, very similar. We find that a piece of machinery keeps going wrong, and that this is exposing people to danger. For example, we find that a virus has infected our computer, or that a hacker has got into our computer, and so on. And this internal event, has identified that risk is maybe still there. Leading event indicators. The example of a leading event indicator is where you have a customer and they begin taking kind of 30 days credit, and then after a few months they begin taking 40 days credit, and then after a while it's 60 days credit, and so on. The debt hasn't gone bad yet, but we're kind of slipping towards an area where there's increasing risk that we're going to suffer a bad debt. So essentially that is what a leading event indicator is, that there's a real advance warning really that something nasty may be going to happen in the future, and therefore maybe we can stop it. Trends and root causes. We want to try and see behind the trend to the root cause. So the trend might be that sales are going down. And identifying that sales is going down, it's not good news, of course, here. But what we want to do is to try to get behind the trend and see the actual cause of this risk to our prosperity. And it might be that it's old products. They were being overtaken by our competitors. It might be that our competitors are being more successful in advertising. Escalation triggers. An escalation trigger, I think it's very like these leading event indicators here. But an example of an escalation trigger could be that you have an employee who has had a number of incidents where the employee hasn't been conforming with company policy. That maybe they have been offering people discounts which are too high, something of that sort. So what you can do is you can kind of give them two warnings and say, look, you've done it once, we've warned you. If you do it again, then you're out. Because you've proved yourself to be untrustworthy. You've proved yourself not to be able to change according to what we need you to do to keep the risk to the company down. And then event interdependencies. So an example of an event interdependency, if there is a risk, say, of fire, then there is going to be a risk of water damage. So we might have our computer system in the basement kind of locked away pretty safe. We've got lots and lots of doors to the computer system which are fireproof and so on. We know that fire rises. So far as fire is concerned, having your IT system in the basement is quite good. But the problem is then if the firefighters come and they begin spraying your offices with water, or the sprinklers go off and so on, then of course the water will find its way down. And the interdependency there is between water damage and fire damage. And we might be able to spot risks in that way. But it's completely open-ended. It could be another example, I suppose it's from external events. You get complaints letters from customers. So a complaints letter from customers, maybe increasing complaints letters from customers saying this product keeps breaking down. There is a risk there to your trade, and you need to take that on board and do something about it. Now, on this little risk management cycle, having identified the risk, the next thing we do is go on and understand and assess the scale of the risk. This is done on risk mapping here, where we look at the severity and the impact, and we look at the probability of the frequency. And we mentioned this kind of before a little bit. So, what are we going to do? This will give us some information about what we might do about these risks here. So, if we have something which is of low impact and low probability that we dispatch the wrong goods to somebody. So we know it's low probability because we've got quite good systems and somebody is double checking the goods going, so it's not going to happen very often. Most of our orders are relatively small, so even if it does happen, we're not going to irritate a really big customer, and we have the wrong dispatch. We'll occasionally get through there. It might not be worth doing anything about it. The fix, the cure, if you like, the treatment, might be more expensive than this occasional wrong dispatch. Over here, if the frequency is low, but the severity of impact is high, then we need really to take some action. One of the sorts of action we could take, I'm not saying it's ideal, another example here is of course fire. Your offices will not often burn down, but if they do burn down, then of course it's going to be very, very serious. One of the things you might do is for the fire example, is to think of insuring. So even if the worst does happen, we're going to be compensated for that. In terms of the industrial injuries, we want to reduce the impact there. The probability is really low. Our people are still well trained and so on there. But a way in which we could maybe reduce the impact is to have a kind of trained medics on site, so that if the industrial injury does happen, we can, resuscitate the person, or we can, in a chemical works, we can apply kind of antidote to the chemical poisoning and so on. Out here, where it's high and high, the frequency is high, the severity and impact is high. We really want to try to avoid this happening if we can. One of the things we might do is to try to get our senior staff on long-term contracts. So it's very difficult for them to leave at very short notice. And over here, where the severity is low but the frequency is high, we maybe have to live with it. It's going to have to happen here. Maybe we put up with it. Or maybe what we say is we will have enough other staff there who can fill the gaps there, so this will keep the severity low. Really what we're saying, and what it comes down to, is sometimes called a Tara approach, or sometimes called a 4Ts approach. I think on this slide, just watch, we have the things the wrong way, or not the wrong way around, but a different way around. In particular, I think we've swapped these two around here, the high and the low here. So if we have something, it doesn't matter, you can see them drawn anyway, but if we have something which is highly likely and highly damaging, then one of the ways to try and deal with that is to terminate it, to avoid it. So if, for example, we decide to go into another country and we know there's a high probability that we will not do well in that other country, and if we don't do well in that other country, we've spent an awful lot of money and I'm going to have to write an awful lot off, then the way we can do that is simply not do it, not deal with that opportunity at all, simply avoid the risk. Here, where the frequency of probability is low but the severity is high, you can transfer it maybe to a subcontractor, or you can insure it like we did with the fire. So if we were having to remove asbestos from our building, a very dangerous product there, if it goes wrong, then of course there's a very serious consequence in terms of people's health. There may not be much of a chance of it going wrong, but what we can do is to say, instead of doing it ourselves, where we're going to have a little bit of a chance of messing it up, we will subcontract that to someone. We will transfer this difficult bit of work to somebody else. If it's down here, low and low, low frequency, low severity, you just live with it, you just put it up. The occasional small customer going into liquidation. If you're going to take any risks at all, really, these are the ones you're going to have to take. And finally, we have relatively high frequency, but relatively low severity. What we're going to try and do is maybe to reduce the frequency with which this happens. So what we could do there, it could be staff leaving us and so on. And we could say, well, you have to give us a certain amount of notice. We're kind of controlling or reducing the risk as best we can, or treating the risks, as it's called. So we can treat the risk, we can avoid the risk, we can tolerate or accept the risk there, and we can transfer the risk, are the 4Ts or the TARA type of framework. What you tend to be doing if you treat the risk is we're going to be reducing the risk. And a couple of bits of terminology here. We've got gross risk and net risk. Gross risk is a name given to the risk before you do anything whatsoever by way of controls or transfer or mitigation. Mitigation just means reduce the severity in some way. And then you apply your various weapons, so to speak, to manage that risk, which will to shrink down that risk. So, what we have here, for example, is an asset at risk. And let's say the asset at risk is going to be receivables. We're really looking at bad debts here. And one of the ways in which you can reduce the asset at risk is to have a credit limit. So if you have no controls whatsoever here, you might be allowing 50,000. Then you say, well, that's 50,000. Risking 50,000 is far too much asset at risk there. Maybe what I'll do is I'll reduce down the credit limit, and we will have credit limits of only 10,000. So now the debt goes bad. I'm never going to lose 50,000 from one person. The maximum I'm going to lose is 10,000. And then what you say is, well, what about the probability or the threat that this person will actually fail, will actually go into liquidation? And what we can do here is to reduce the probability that a customer goes into liquidation by not taking on that customer until you do a credit check. So you go through court records and finding, has this person ever failed on a debt before? You can look at their financial statements. You can get maybe references from their bank. And if you do these credit checks and everything comes in looking good, then the threat of them going bad, even for 10,000, is much lower. But if you just accept any stranger really as a credit customer, then the threat of a random customer going bad is actually quite high. So do a credit check to reduce the threat. And then what we say, if this debt goes bad and we're not going to get the 10,000 we were hoping to get at the end of the month, what's that going to do to us? What's the effect on us, the vulnerability on us, and so on? And if we're really relying on that 10,000 to pay the wages, to pay the rent, to pay the bank, we're very vulnerable. So we can reduce the vulnerability here, maybe by having more cash. Don't spend up to your limit, and so you're relying on this money coming in. Have a bit of spare cash, perhaps, in a deposit account. Or if you haven't got the spare cash, have the right to use a loan or to go up to an overdraft limit or something. So now, if this debt goes bad, first of all, there was less chance that it went bad. Then, if it went bad, it was only 10,000 that went bad and not 50,000. And finally, because we are not relying on this money, the effect on us, though not pleasant, is not deadly. And finally, we have a risk register here. When we have basically identified the risk areas, when we've understood and assessed the scale of the risk, and we've decided what we're going to do with it, and we're going on to then begin to implement a strategy and so on here, and to see what's going to be done about it here, we want to keep a record of this. And that's really the risk register. So think of it as almost a big, long, almost spreadsheet going out here. So what you would have kind of in the first column here is a description of the risk. Bad debt. Okay. And then what we can do out here is to say, well, let's say it's one customer. We make a little assessment. Well, what is the chance? So this is bad debt. And then we say out here, well, what is the kind of probability of this major customer going bad? And you kind of assess that. And then out here you have the impact. You know, how much is this major customer likely to owe us? And then what we would say, the risk owners, is really who's responsible for this. You know, who's the responsibility going to be put on to do something about this risk. We will put on various dates, the dates of identification, the dates in which it's reviewed, and then we have out here the mitigation. What are we going to do about this risk? So what we might be saying is, well, what we're going to do about this risk is we're going to kind of liaise with the customer and say we're reviewing all credit limits. Maybe we're going to reduce your credit limit. Maybe we'll go out and maybe too late, but maybe we go out and we get some credit references in about this customer and so on. Maybe we say we're going to also follow up bad debts or follow up debts which are slowing down or which appear not to be paid, put a proper credit control system into effect so that the likelihood of the debt going bad is lower. So this is the kind of mitigation, what's going to be done. And then quite often what it has afterwards is a new P and a new I. What is our kind of risk exposure after we put in these mitigation effects? What is now the probability of it going bad? What is now likely to be the impact on us if this debt, presumably smaller debt, is actually going to go bad? What we should be doing here, we've got a responsible person, could be the risk owner and so on here. We're going to have the dates in here, a kind of deadline date, if you like, by which this should be implemented and so on. And then what you want really is people kind of signing it off, putting the date. Do this by the end of the month, and then when it's done, they put on this was done by the 29th of the month, and I'm signing it off as having accomplished this risk mitigation strategy. If you don't have this risk register, this kind of control document, then you're almost wasting your time at going through the whole process of risk identification, which is really what this is here. We've identified the risk, but they just lie there without any further work or being done to actually manage those risks. So you need people, dates, objectives, signing off, real responsibility before it's going to work.